the motion be agreed to? And I give a call to the honourable member for Parramatta.
Thank you, Speaker. Let me be absolutely clear. This government is fully committed to climate action and net zero by 2050. This government is fully committed to 82% renewables by 2030. And since we came to office, there's been a 25% increase in renewables in the national energy market. And this has driven both total emissions and emissions intensity to all-time record lows. We've doubled the rate of approvals for energy projects and provided over $1 billion for homes and businesses to upgrade their energy efficiency. But, Speaker, the Greens don't want to talk about that. The Greens don't want to talk about the enormous progress that has been made on climate change during this Labor government after 10 years of inactivity. Instead, what they want to do is stand up and make a range of outrageous slurs against Labor and Labor MPs. They want to stand there and make a series of outlandish claims. And the reason is, Deputy Speaker, the reason is that the Greens are fearful of one thing above all, and that is a sensible and practical path to address climate change. Because if we have a sensible and practical path to address climate change, what we don't have is the politics of outrage. What we don't have is the ability for them to make the perfect the enemy of the good. They are happy when the Liberals are in government doing nothing on climate change because it gives them the ability to rev up the outrage politics of climate change. That's why they're so annoyed about sensible, practical, middle-of-the-road climate change policies. And, Speaker, I saw this firsthand. In 2009 and 2010, I worked on the then Labor government's carbon pollution reduction scheme, a plan to put an emissions trading scheme into Australia for the first time, a plan that would have been world-leading, a plan that would have made a massive difference to Australia over the last 15 years. And who opposed it? The Greens. And why did they oppose it? Because sensible, methodical progress on climate change is an anathema to the politics that they want to run on this issue. Time and time again, the Greens are opposed to sensible and practical change. Time and time again, the Greens make the perfect the enemy of the good. And the reason is that there is nothing worse for their political strategy than having positive progress, the kind of positive progress that this government has implemented over the last 2 years, making a real difference on renewables, making a real difference on transmission, signing up to ambitious targets, bringing the business sector and the rest of the community, the unions, all together around a national target that we can actually deliver, signing back up to our international commitments, being a leader on the world stage in climate change. All of this is exactly what the Greens do not want. Practical, sensible change. That's why they're trying to whip up outrage on this issue. That's why first thing in after the break, bang, into the suspension of standing orders, bang, full of outrage, bang, lots of slurs against individual Labor MPs, bang, lots of outrage in the speech. All of it is because the thing they fear most is practical, real change that makes the politics of outrage irrelevant. Well, Speaker, we are going to continue on this path. We are going to continue to methodically and practically work through the challenges to address the climate crisis in this nation and around the world. And we have seen more progress in 2 years than was able to be achieved in the last 10 years. More progress in 2 years than has been able to be achieved in the entire period of Liberal government. And I'm sorry to say more progress in 2 years than was achieved in the last Labor government when we made the mistake of thinking the Greens were fair dinkum on climate change. We made that mistake. And look what happened. They wouldn't support an emissions trading scheme in this country. And how the world would have been different, how Australia would have been different if they hadn't made the perfect the enemy of the good. They voted against the CPRS then, and that is exactly the tactic they have right now. That was a once-in-a-generation opportunity to address climate change in this country, to put us on a sensible path towards a clean energy future. The Greens took that off the table. You know, the member for Griffith stood up a moment ago and he said it's a mistake to think that Australia only has a small role to play in addressing global climate change. Well, we agree, Speaker. We agree. We think Australia has a big role. That's why it's such a shame that back in 2010 the Greens stopped Australia from playing that role, from putting in a world-leading emissions trading scheme. And that's why it's such a shame that they're trying to scupper Australia's sensible, practical progress being made in the course of the last 2 years. They don't want Australia playing that role on the world stage. They preferred it back when Australia was making no progress under the Morrison government. And in fact, to quote the leader of the Greens from just a moment ago, he said this government is worse than Scott Morrison. Well, it's worse than Scott Morrison for him, friends. It's worse than Scott Morrison for him, because by doing sensible, practical things to address climate change, we're taking away the politics of outrage. He loved Scott Morrison. He loved the coal in the parliament. That enabled him to really rev up the outrage, to dial it up to 10. And that's why, Speaker, we're not seeing them come into this parliament and make any attacks on the Liberals' positions. We're not seeing them come in and support Labor's sensible positions. What we see instead is them pursuing the politics of outrage, because they don't want progress on climate change. Sensible, practical policies are their enemies, and they have always been their enemy. And that's why, Speaker, they don't come in here and talk about the change that has occurred in Australia over the last 10 years. They don't attack Peter Dutton for his ridiculous, scandalous neglect on climate change. They want to focus on the fact that Australia is making progress, and they want to attack the government for that progress. What they would love is for a world in which no progress was made. They could go back to revving up the politics of outrage. That, Speaker, is the difference. Labor is going to make practical, methodical change. We've made an enormous amount of progress in the last 2 years, and that is incredibly important to Australians. Speaker, in my electorate, we face enormous consequences from climate change. In Parramatta, people are already paying the price of the impacts of climate change. Every summer, Parramatta gets almost 10 degrees hotter than the rest of Sydney. In 2019, 1 out of every 8 days were above 35 degrees. And Parramatta is prone to catastrophic flooding, natural disasters that are getting worse and worse. And in some of the published scenarios, up to 25% of Parramatta could become a flood zone. That's why the people of Parramatta have been working to deliver a climate adaptation plan, a plan that addresses the local impacts of climate change and supports our progress to dealing with those impacts of climate change, while at the same time the government gets on with mitigation. Last week we delivered our Parramatta Climate Action Plan, a plan supported by members of the community and community groups from across the electorate, distilling 137 community-led recommendations into a plan that we can action over the next several years. That's sensible, methodical progress on climate change, real practical action. At a local level, I'm so proud of the people of Parramatta for coming together on that plan, because that practical, methodical plan is exactly the opposite of the politics of outrage that we see from the Greens as they come into this parliament. Speaker, for the first time in a decade, we have a government taking climate change seriously. For the first time in a decade, we have Australia back at the international table. For the first time in a decade, we've got renewables going up. For the first time in a decade, we have consensus from business groups, from union groups, from community groups on the need to address climate change. And the people who cannot bear that consensus, the people who are completely opposed to that, who recognise it as the biggest threat to their political strategy, are the Australian Greens political party. No wonder they've come into this House and expressed such outrage.